Hello, everybody. It is good to be back. Happy Monday after a couple weeks off. Um, for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about using your rewards or reinforcers in training more effectively. And so today, I'm going to be focusing on when and where to reinforce, and I'll do an example at the end. And this can be done with treats, toys, whatever it is you're using as a reinforcer in your training. So here's what we'll talk about today. First, kind of a big picture view of what influences the effectiveness of your positive reinforcers. So most of you are using treats, but like I said, that could be other stuff, toys, activities. What to think about when deciding when and where to deliver those rewards in training. And then, since it is, I believe it is Dog Bite Prevention Week, we will do a muzzle training example looking at when and where to deliver reinforcers. Okay, reinforcer effectiveness. I think this is a really interesting topic. And there are many things that can affect how effective your reinforcers are in your training. One is the delay between the behavior that you want to reinforce and the actual reinforcer. Sooner is better. Usually, you want to get the reinforcer to your dog within a second or two of the behavior that you want to increase. Sometimes you can get away with longer delays, but especially in early training when your dog's learning a new behavior, you want to be careful to really try to get that reinforcement to your dog right away. The dog's preference for the reinforcer you're using. So is it something they love, something that's just kind of meh, so-so to them? And this is complicated by the fact that this can change not only day to day, but moment to moment and within a training session. And I bet some of you have seen this. If you start a training session with a particular treat, your dog seems really into it. And then a little later, they seem to lose a bit of interest. Some dogs, you don't see this as much, and some you do. And then it also depends on which reinforcer you're using. But just something to keep in mind. The value of the reinforcer to your dog matters, but that can change. Magnitude of reinforcement. So not just is the thing I'm using something my dog likes, but am I giving enough of it to be reinforcing to my dog or giving them access to something for long enough? Reinforcer duration, you can think of something like a game of tug. You could just let your dog grab the tug and do one little tug with them, or you could tug with them for 30 seconds. Those would be potential, at least reinforcers of differing durations. Rate of reinforcement. So how often is that behavior reinforced when it happens? When you're teaching new skills, you really want to reinforce every occurrence of the behavior that you are trying to build. So later on, you can start to thin out reinforcement, but in the beginning, reinforce every time. How much of that reinforcer has your dog had access to recently? So you can think of this in terms of, are they deprived a bit of that reinforcer, or are they satiated? Are they full or sick? Could they be sick of it now or just not that interested? So a lot of you have taken group classes where you train with food, and the instructor will ask you to not feed your dog before class. That's an example of using a little bit of temporary deprivation to try to increase the value of food reinforcers. And the same could be said for something like toy play. Like if you were going to use a game of fetch as a reinforcer for your dog, it probably would be a good idea not to go out and play at an hour of fetch with your dog before you train. Variation in reinforcers. This is really interesting, and we'll talk about this more next week, I think. But often if you rotate through a variety of reinforcers within a session, you can actually get better results than if you just use a single reinforcer. What is your dog's history with a particular reinforcer? So say your dog gets something for free all the time, like it's just available. If you then try to make them work for that same reinforcer, now it's not free anymore, it might not be super effective, at least in the short term, because in the past, it's just been available to them. how you give the reinforcer to your dog, and we've talked about this in some past webinars and past sort of weekly videos. There are ways of delivering food, toys, whatever reinforcer you're going to give that'll be more or less engaging to your dog, more or less valuable. And a lot of times, a delivery method that is a little more interactive with your dog might sort of make that reinforcer more powerful. And then novelty. A lot of you have probably seen this effect with your dogs as well. Like a new toy or a brand new treat is just more exciting to your dog than something that's around all the time they've had for a while. So having something novel in your treat bag or a novel toy can make for a more effective reinforcer, at least, as long as the novelty aspect is still there. Oh, and just a reminder, if you have questions during as I'm going through the slides, go ahead and put them below where you're watching the video, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. So these are just kind of general. This isn't an exhaustive list, but I have quite a few points, just general things that can have an effect on how sort of potent or valuable your reinforcer is, and how effective your training is then when you're using that reinforcer. All right, so today we're going to look at some specifics about when and where to deliver reinforcers and how that might affect your training. So when should you reinforce? Like we talked about a second ago, usually you want to reinforce pretty immediately. So you say, you ask your dog to sit, they sit. If you're using food as a reinforcer, you want to pop that treat into their mouth pretty much, as soon as their butt hits the ground. You want to do it every time in early training. And this is sort of not really a when, but it's relevant. You do want that criteria for reinforcement in early training to be pretty easy, so that you are getting a lot of stuff to reinforce. Now, later in training, say your dog is an old hat at some behavior, they can do it at home, no problem. Maybe they can do it in a number of other sort of contexts or locations. Then you can start, if it's important to you, you can start adding some delays in the reinforcement, because in real life, sometimes it'll take you a second to get a reinforcer, and sometimes there won't be reinforcement at all. You just you don't have anything with you at the time, but you still want your dog to do the behavior. So in later, more advanced training, it's not a bad idea to occasionally introduce some delays to reinforcement after the behavior, and also have some responses that actually aren't reinforced. Now, this is only once the dog can do the behavior in that scenario and context for when they're reinforced every time. All right, I hope that makes sense. I'm always a little hesitant to talk about delays and intermittent reinforcement because most people don't reinforce every time anyway, even early on. And if you thin out the schedule too much, if you reinforce too intermittently, the behavior is going to fall apart. So do be careful with that. It's something that you and your trainer should have explicitly in your training plan so that you don't overdo it. Okay, how to reinforce. The location where you deliver your reinforcer matters. Sometimes it's helpful to give it in the place you want your dog to be. So in this photo on the slide, if this person is training a heel, like a really tight heel at her side like that, she'd probably want to put the treat into her dog's mouth where the dog's mouth is right now, not, out to the side or in front or behind. That will help. I'll show you an example with muzzle training, but that can give you, in a sense, a little bit of free duration in that position because your dog is like, this is where the food's happening. I'm staying here. Sometimes you want to use a reinforcer delivery to get your dog into a position that sets up your next training repetition. And this is not always where you want your dog to stay for the training repetition. So sometimes we'll use like a treat toss away from us to set up another repetition where we want the dog then approaching us again. And you can do both. You can certainly, give your dog a treat in the position you want them to stay in for the target behavior, the thing you're training, and then also toss a treat away from you to set up the next rep. And then how to reinforce another point is think about, is there a way I can deliver this reinforcer that'll make it more valuable? And we're not going to talk about that today in the example, but think about ways to make reinforcer more fun. Like, do you just kind of hand your dog a tug toy, or do you make it come alive and, twist it and pull it around, make it move? Do you hand your dog a treat, or you toss it into the air for them to catch, or roll it along the ground for them to chase? Those things can make that treat more valuable as a reinforcer. All right. If you have any questions, please put them under the video. I'm going to move into our muzzle training example. Okay. So I bet some of you are doing muzzle training right now. I know a lot of you in our audience have dogs who are struggle with some fear or aggression. So I hope this is relevant to you. So say we're training a dog to wear a muzzle happily. When is it we are going to reinforce in our training? We're going to start with very low criteria, as I mentioned before, and I have a little video example of this with my dog Juno, who is meeting her new muzzle for the first time. So when we think about what the end of our training will look like, what we want our dog to be able to do at the end of the training, for me, that is, my dog should walk up to the muzzle, stick their nose into it, stand still while I buckle it, and then walk around and move around normally with it on without trying to paw it off their face. So when you think of that, this first step might seem extremely conservative, but this is usually where I start with most equipment training. So here's that muzzle on the floor, and the criteria is Juno approaching the muzzle. That's it. And you see here, actually, I'm tossing the treat away to set up the next repetition so she can approach the muzzle again. Here she's trying to figure out what's going on. Just waited her out, and she'll eventually, I think I'll prompt her, and then she'll, all right, go up to the muzzle again. Okay. So that's an example of really easy, a really low bar for that first step. Although for some dogs, that would still be too high. And then I might place the muzzle farther away from me or something, or even reward them looking at the muzzle. All right, immediately, remember, we want to reinforce, deliver that reinforcer right after the behavior that we're trying to build. And a couple of things that can help you do this to sort of make your reinforcement come faster or ready to go right away is, one, to have all your treats prepped in whatever size you want them to be, out of the packaging, and sometimes even keeping treats in your hand. Now, I often try to get treats out of people's hands because I don't want the dog to have to see a treat in the hand before they do a behavior. I don't want them to discriminate, like, oh, now there's a treat, I'll do the behavior, but if I don't see a treat in your hand, I'm not going to do it. But for some things like this muzzle training, it's, at least in early training, it can be helpful to keep a couple treats in your hand so you can get them to the dog really quickly when there's a fleeting behavior you're trying to reinforce. So let's see. I have a little video example here. So here I've got string cheese that I've cut up and made little strings of that'll poke through a muzzle. And I have one in my other hand so I can get it to Juno pretty quickly. If I had to dig it out of a bag each time or a pocket, there'd be more of a delay. And maybe that delay wouldn't matter, but maybe it would. Okay, and then in later training, I talked about how you can then maybe start to delay reinforcement or reinforce more intermittently. So I have a video of more advanced step in muzzle training here. So here Coco is learning to walk in her new muzzle. And you'll see at first here, she's, sorry about that. She's going to be feeding about every step. So, she's just starting to walk with the muzzle, so she's feeding every step. Now she's going to feed a couple steps at a time. So increasing criteria and making the reinforcement a little more delayed. and a little bit random. So there she just reinforced after, a little lap down and back across the yard. Here I think she's gonna walk back and forth 3 times. And then she'll do a shorter one, I believe here, where she just walks a few steps away and then reinforces there. So it's a little bit less predictable. She's not reinforcing always, every 2 steps, every 1 step, every 5 steps. So this is in more advanced training. Oh, and this was just a cute idea for building comfort with the muzzle. She's playing with her. I think that might be a jolly egg that has been partially destroyed. All right. So those are some examples of when to reinforce. Does anyone have questions about the when? Right away, low criteria, have the treats ready to go so you can be quick. Only stretch out your intervals and your rate of reinforcement later in training. Okay. And now we'll talk about quickly where to reinforce. So you remember the where, when we're thinking about where do I want to give this treat or this toy, one thing we can ask is, well, is this a situation where it might be helpful for me to deliver the treat in a place I want my dog to stay? Like I need to build duration in this position or whatever. I want them to stay here. Or is there somewhere I could deliver the treat that would set up my next training repetition so I can quickly get into it? Or is there a way I can deliver the treat or toy that will make it more fun for my dog or more valuable? And for muzzle training, this is a nice example of where you deliver the treat can help you keep the dog where you want, which is with their nose in the muzzle, which is the behavior that you're going to need at the end. Your dog happily walking into the muzzle, keeping their nose there long enough for you to clip it on, and then walking around in it. So I did 2 different approaches of this with Juno so you can see. So here, the behavior that I am trying to reinforce is Juno sticking her nose into the muzzle. And in these first few reps, I'm going to give the reinforcer away outside of the muzzle. And so what happens here, you'll see, is that she sticks her nose in, but then she needs to pull her face out of the muzzle to get the treat. And this could work against me because I want her to stick her nose in there and hold it there. So instead, if I switch to here, feeding through the muzzle, so the food is going to happen in the muzzle. She's still in the beginning she pulls her nose out right away. But as I do more reps of this, where the food keeps happening in the muzzle, she starts leaving. Oh, right, I'm going to stay here. This is where the food happens. And I start to get rid of that annoying head pulling out of muzzle behavior. So that's an example of how where you deliver the treat can either help or hinder your training. All right, folks, I hope that was helpful and that you got some ideas about how your reinforcer delivery might affect how effective your training is. If you are looking for help with muzzle training, we do this right now mostly on a private training basis. And the link at the bottom there is where to go to sign up for private training if you want one-on-one help from us. Otherwise, you've got lots of free resources on our website, in the blog. We're on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook page and support group as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I really appreciate it. If you have questions after this is not live anymore, it's recorded. If you put your question below the video, I'll still get an alert and I'll try to answer it as soon as I can. All right, folks, have a great week. I will see you next week with more reinforcer advice.